Minasan konnichiwa. Hey everyone. Japan has one of the richest literary cultures in the world. So in this video, I want to give you a brief history of 1000 years of Japanese literature. In the first segment, I'll discuss the tale of Genji, perhaps the most important work of Japanese literature, which is also considered the world's first true novel. It depicts male psychology from a female perspective. Then I'll discuss the history of haiku, a literary movement that appreciates the beauty of nature and the simplicity of Japanese life, which has become a global phenomenon. Then I'll discuss the works of some of the greatest Japanese writers, including Natsume Soseki, Ryunosuke Akutagawa, Yasunari Kawabata, Osamu Dazai, Kobo Abe, Yukio Mishima, and Haruki Murakami. But what makes Japanese literature so unique? First, no other literature captures the loneliness of the human condition. While we all in big cities, crowded places, constantly bump into each other, we are ultimately lonely creatures with our own thoughts, emotions, desires, and dreams. So this loneliness is perhaps sharpest in Japanese literature that cuts like a German knife, or I should say Japanese knife. Second, the Japanese literature is unique because of its minimalism. While classic Russian authors wrote huge novels, the Japanese writers kept it short. Of course, there are some exceptions, but most Japanese novels can be read in 1 or 2 sittings. Japanese people in general do not talk too much, so the same applies to literature. They keep it short and sweet. Third, Japanese literature is less plot-driven. This applies to culture too. The process is as important as the outcome of something. So Japanese novels tend to rely less on intricate plots. This is why Japanese culture is considered a how culture that appreciates the process, while the West is more of a why culture, which is more outcome driven. Another aspect of Japanese literature is that it's very similar to the 19th century Russian literature in that both are in response to Western literature. And in case of Japanese literature, early works are in response to Chinese literature, and modern Japanese literature is in response to Western literature and culture. Japan, being a highly group-oriented culture, had to deal with a very individualistic Western culture. So most Japanese novels deal with how the individual finds it hard to navigate in a highly group-oriented society, while their influence came from the West, a highly individualized software. Another element of Japanese literature is its inferiority complex. While with their rich history, most people in the West had no clue how rich the Japanese literature or culture was due to its uniquely difficult language. So naturally, these Japanese authors felt the West wasn't appreciating Japanese culture and literature to the same degree that the Japanese were appreciating, absorbing, and copying Western culture as well as literature. This inferiority complex is not unique to Japan because this is present in most non-Western cultures. This even shows up in Russia, particularly in the works of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. In fact, the duo were highly motivated to create a legacy that matched the likes of Shakespeare, Goethe, Balzac, Victor Hugo, etc. to show how capable the Russians were. The same is true about the Japanese writers. So in this video, I hope to show how amazing Japanese literature is. So get yourself some sushi and sake and let's talk about Japanese literature. We will start in the 11th century. By the way, if you want to support the channel, you can buy the script of this video in a book form. Not only it gives you the option to read the entire thing in one go, but it also helps the channel to produce long-form content. The link is in the description. Thank you so much. The Tale of Genji is considered the most important work of Japanese literature and the world's first ever novel written 1000 years ago by a female author, Shikibu Murasaki. But who was she and why did she write such a monumental work of literature? Lady Murasaki was born in 973 to a Japanese noble family called the Fujiwaras in the capital city of Kyoto. She was employed as a lady-in-waiting, which basically means a tutor and personal poet for a princess at the Heian court, where she was asked to write entertaining stories. As we can see in the Tale of Genji, it appears it's primarily written for a female audience, the sex of the city of the day, so to speak, or the 50 shades of poetry. Murasaki, which in Japanese means purple, is not her real name. In fact, a lot of the characters in the Tale of Genji are called by their ranks, not by name. At the time, Japanese women were not allowed to use Chinese writing system, which is called kanji, because it was considered the language of technology and high literature, therefore too masculine. Women use the hiragana writing system, which is easier as there are 40 or so syllables as opposed to thousands of kanji symbols and characters. And also crucially, kana writing system or hiragana is curvier, therefore more feminine. But the irony is that most of the texts available today about the Heian period were written by women. Today, children's books are written in hiragana writing system. So who knows, by 3024, which is 1,000 years from today, we will use children's books as high literature. Japan at the time was distancing itself from China as the Tang dynasty, the most innovative and advanced civilization, had declined. Japanese literature was emerging from the shadow of the Chinese. This was also a period of relative peace, so literature and art started to flourish. Now let me tell you the story. The Tale of Genji has 54 chapters that can be read separately. Perhaps she wrote them in installments. It tells the story of a prince named Hikaru Genji and his romantic adventures with women and his quest for meaning in life. You could say Genji is the hero as well as the villain in the novel because his life is admired from the outside, but on the inside he's suffering a great deal. Genji is the son of the emperor and a concubine, therefore he is not pure blood. With minimal royal duties, he chases women and smokes weed like Prince Harry did. He's not only beautiful, as his name Hikaru means shining, he's also a poet, a thinker, and a very sensitive man, which women admired at the time. So he has everything: looks, brain, and access to royal court. He is in search of a perfect woman. In doing so, he sleeps with a lot of them, old, young, high ranks, low ranks. He even has a child with his stepmother behind his father's back. Despite his success with women, he doesn't feel fulfilled. He is nervous, anxious, stressed of secrecy, and has nightmares. Despite all this, he cannot stop. He's obsessed with women but never satisfied. But why not? Let's put on our Freudian goggles here because Genji lost his mother at a very young age, so he's searching for a woman who resembles his mother. Finally, he finds one who looks exactly like his mother, but she's only 10 years old, and her name is Murasaki, not to be confused with the author. Genji does what he does. He kidnaps the young Murasaki in order to raise her as the perfect wife. Murasaki becomes a central character throughout the novel, and Genji, despite being unfaithful to her, loves her the most, and her suffering due to Genji's infidelity brings the most anguish for him. In fact, her death by the end of the novel also precipitates Genji's own demise, which is marked by an empty chapter in the novel, which is a very clever storytelling device. The book covers some 70 years, all Genji's romantic and political adventures. After his death, it takes a more pessimistic tone as it follows his sons and grandsons' romantic adventures in Uji. The Uji chapters are set in the south of Kyoto, today known as the center of matcha trade. It's a different world, more melodramatic and volatile, with its rivers and canals, but the capital itself, on the other hand, seems like a calm, insular world, and a lot of people are trying to get close to the court, like people are trying to know celebrities today. Overall, the tale of Genji is about love in its all different forms, from the most beautiful, sublime, poetic, to the most ridiculous, tragic, and horrible. Romance in all its colors and shades. Love really has 50 shades in the tale of Genji. The main theme of the novel follows the Buddhist view that life is suffering. The metaphor for life in this novel is the concept of mono no aware, which literally means that everything is passing or fleeting, and it's sad. Good moments pass like a sakura flower that tumbles in the wind and falls down. The tale of Genji captures the emotional record of a bygone historical Heian period, which in itself evokes a moment of mono no aware, how time is fleeting and how it feels sad. Time passes, but sadness lingers. Vincent van Gogh famously said that sadness lasts forever. On the surface, we might think Genji has a fantastic life. Lots of women, no real job to do, always goes from one ceremony to another and lives a very luxurious life as an emperor's son. But you're wrong. With every new sexual conquest, he has to suffer with anxiety that comes after, which shows the psychological depth of the novel. The author knows that on a deeper emotional level, most men are the losers. Genji's beloved wife Murasaki's selflessness, sacrifices, and silent suffering cause the most pain on Genji. The novel basically tells us that for as long as we love, we suffer, which is very similar to another great work of literature, Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. So how do you escape this vicious cycle? Some women, they became Buddhist nuns. And I suppose it has a Buddhist message that in order to be happy, you should really detach yourself from love, money, power, and everything else. Genji's obsession with new women highlights the Buddhist idea of attachment. We suffer because we desire things, and desires are rarely fulfilled. In other words, our desires are endless. No matter what we get, we always want more. Genji dies heartbroken after the death of one woman he loves the most. The novel affirms that life is nothing but endless suffering. The novel is primarily considered a romance, which begins with a discussion about what makes for an ideal wife. For the Heian man, the ideal wife has 4 qualities. She's loyal, cultured, passive, and most importantly, forgiving of men's mistakes. So Genji, despite being unfaithful to his wife Murasaki, by the end of their lives, their love with each other is perhaps the closest to a real love in the novel. The rest is fleeting love, lust, transgressions, affairs, unfulfilled fancies. Murasaki over time falls in love with Genji, is deeply wounded every time he cheats on her. The saddest moment in the novel is when Genji is leaving for exile to America. Oops, I thought I was talking about Prince Harry. When Genji is exiled to Suma, some 80 kilometers to the west of Kyoto, which seems like a completely different country, Murasaki hides her tears from him and cries against a wall. This is one of the most beautiful and saddest moments in the novel. Genji is quite feminine compared to other later samurais or European knights. He doesn't have a sword, he doesn't fight, he writes poems, wears perfumes, and is very polite. While Genji's defining features are his shining beauty as well as his incredible smell, he also tries to maintain his appearance like a modern-day K-pop idols. One thing to note, in those days, married couples slept in different rooms, so this allowed frequent affairs to take place. But if you're expecting some hot, steamy sex scenes, you will be disappointed. You have to read between the lines, as the tale of Genji is very subtle. The rustle of silken dress, youthful voice, suppressed laughter, these are all you get, and the rest, your own imagination. A lot of communication appears through gestures and poetry. Despite not having a clear plot, the tale of Genji reads like a modern novel, as the people and their emotions are portrayed realistically despite their archaic mode of communication. Ultimately, the novel shows how Genji failed to find love. He only realized his true love for Murasaki after her death. Ultimately, you can't get what you want in love. Romance is full of follies and frailties. One of the most unique aspects of the tale of Genji is its realism. It depicts the emotions of its characters in the same way a modern novel does, which is revolutionary. Therefore, some consider it world's first true novel. Books of this period from other parts of the world didn't write about reality. Instead, were mostly about myths, legends. People lived reality that was harsh and didn't want to read about it. Another unique thing about the novel, it's written in prose. Poetry was literature, and prose seemed like keeping a diary or some accounting. This novel is the first mirror of reality written in prose. So what is it like to be in the Heian Japan? Genji's world is male-dominated, not unique to Japan. But what's unique about the tale of Genji is perhaps for the first time in human history, a novel pays full attention to the private and domestic affairs without talking about politics, warfare, plagues, or some other social upheavals. The novel purely focuses on the mating dance between men and women. Men, despite causing women a lot of misery, are not happy either. Men's motivations tend to be sexual, while women's motivations tend to be social, material comfort, and they want to give birth to the next emperor. The novel gives vivid description of physical distance between men and women, the shoji walls, the curtained rooms, the gaze at someone's shadow. Genji often hears women's voices or music that they're playing, therefore imagines them to be beautiful. Once he gets close, he is disappointed. Today, men show off their wealth with expensive cars, while women hide their wrinkles with makeup. The same was true back then. The novel is a postcard from the Heian period in Japan, a dazzling window into the 10th century Kyoto. The Heian period was peaceful, which allowed men and women plenty of time to chase one another, compose poetry, write love letters, enjoy the change of seasons, watch the moon, perfect their handwritings and calligraphy. Poetry is prominent. It has 800 waka poems quoted in the novel. Waka poetry is a precursor to the modern haiku. It is short, about 4 lines, a kind of reflection of one's own feelings or often idealizing certain beauties or expressions of one's inner thoughts. The koto musical instrument is also present in the novel to give it sound and voice. The novel also has descriptions about gardens, flowers, the moon, perfume, etc. The Kyoto of this novel is small yet very closed off, a sort of bubble where everyone knows the meaning of a poem that alludes to certain things. In a way, it's not inviting you in, but lets you watch as an observer and somebody who can't understand everything. Despite its isolation, the people inside this bubble had piercing eyes, terrible mouths. To skip it all, Buddhism was a real window. If you wanted to get away from political and romantic follies or bickering, you would retire in a temple and devote the rest of your lives to the service of the Buddha. Today, Kyoto has about 1,600 temples dotted all over the city, mostly former villas of rich people donated after their death. Emperors too retired from politics to devote themselves to Buddhism towards the end of their lives. For women, becoming a nun was an escape from being pursued by men. So Buddhism provided freedom from society's entanglement. If you visit Kyoto, you will notice that most of the temples are outside the city, often in the forest or perched on the mountainsides. Escape or retreat from the crowd. Well, now it is packed with tourists, but back in those days, they were places of peace and quiet. How about today? During the Meiji period, which is from 1870s to 1910s, Japan rapidly westernized in the same way Genji's world adopted Chinese things 1,000 years earlier. With the Meiji Restoration, Shintoism became a state religion, not Buddhism. Japanese intellectuals and scholars found the Tale of Genji like a sacred text to show the Japanese superiority to the Chinese as well as to the West. For instance, Shinobu Orikuchi, a Japanese folklorist, asks, "What is China?" He answers the question, "The people who don't know the Tale of Genji." Another intellectual, Ito Jun, suggests that West values patriarchy, while Japan is very maternal and points at this novel as an evidence. Yamato Damashi, or the Japanese spirit, was first mentioned in this novel. Yamato is the name of the ancient Japan around Nara period, before the contact with China. It was the Chinese who named Japan the land of where the sun rises. Just remember, during the Heian period, the Japanese loved everything about China, and especially the Tang dynasty. Murasaki herself praises the Japanese spirit that grows within a Chinese education. But later, intellectuals and politicians understood the whole work as Japanese and nothing else. So the Tale of Genji became one of the symbols of Japanese nationalism when Japan started to modernize. But there was a problem. The novel is not political, and most importantly, most Japanese couldn't read it. Since the Tale of Genji was written in court Japanese, now it's difficult for most Japanese people to comprehend in its original, so it's translated and taught in schools. Despite the linguistic barrier, there are many similarities between the Tale of Genji and Japan today. For example, even today, politics is rarely discussed. Seasonal gift-giving is a real thing. Silence is not awkward. Communication is very subtle. And ceremonies are still important. but also a few things that are missing from the novel but are very big today. For example, little to no mention of food, while today Japanese are obsessed with food. Perfume is a huge thing in the novel, but today most Japanese don't wear perfume. Withdrawing from society into Buddhist temple was big back then, and it's no longer practiced. The Tale of Genji has many international fans, including Virginia Woolf, Jorge Luis Borges, but I see many similarities with one of the most famous novels of the 20th century and one of my favorite novels of all time, Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Here are two quotes, one from each. The first is a poem composed by Genji when he exiles himself to Suma, leaving his Murasaki behind. Though changed I wander far away, my soul shall still remain with you. Perhaps in this mirror's mystic ray, my face may linger still in view. This second quote is what Proust says about people who have viewed an object prior to us. There they have left something of themselves behind. Quote, some mystery-loving minds maintain that objects retain something of the eyes that have looked at them, that we can see monuments and pictures only through an almost tangible veil woven over them through the centuries by the love and contemplations of so many admirers. Both quotes talk about how we leave something of ourselves behind in objects we come in contact, which has part of us for others to find. Here are a few other similarities between the two novels. Proust's novel is famous for how time is fleeting, and Genji too. Both novels center on inner emotion conflicts and the suffering that love brings. Both novels give great importance to small things. Both novels are about snobs, Proust's Parisian high society and Genji's imperial court in Kyoto. The distance between the imagined and the real is apparent in both novels. Both Genji imagines his love for the next woman to be incredible, but after he sleeps with them and it just comes to nothing, empty. Proust spends hours and hours talking about his imagined beauty that he would experience in the future, and when he does, it's absolutely nothing to what he had imagined. Both novels appreciate art immensely. Claude Monet appears as a character in Proust's novel as Elstere, who paints impressionist art, and who we know about Monet was influenced by Japanese delicate and subtle paintings. Both protagonists, Marcel in Search of Lost Time and Genji in The Tale of Genji, are infatuated with their mothers. So both were suffering from mommy issues. Both novels are ultimately about suffering. It's true that Don Quixote has a more Aristotelian structure of beginning, middle, and end because it was written 600 years after Genji. Given the level of realism, psychological depth in The Tale of Genji, we can safely say that not only it's the most important work of Japanese literature, but it's also the world's first true novel. In the next segment, I'll discuss the history of haiku, a literary movement that actually began with waka poems mentioned in this novel. Previously, I discussed the psychological depth of The Tale of Genji, which was written in prose 900 years before Sigmund Freud. While it was written in prose, it has some 800 waka poems, which is a precursor to the modern haiku, which has become an international phenomenon today. So in this segment, I'll discuss the history of haiku by talking about four masters. But first, what is haiku? Haiku is a short-form poem consisting of 17 syllables with 3 lines, 5, 7, 5 syllables. Haiku also has a seasonal reference while also contrasting two things. Let's look at a famous haiku in Japanese literature by the father of haiku, Matsuo Basho. Furu ike ya kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto. Let's look at the translation. Old pond, frog leaps in, water's sound. Here the old pond symbolizes the silence of the past or history, while the last line, the sound of frog jumping, breaks that silence. Hence, haiku creates contrast. Frogs are a common sight in Japan during the spring and summer months, hence the seasonal reference. Haiku is a little like a story. The first line sets the premise, old pond. The second line has action, the hero being the frog leaping. And the last line is the climax. The silence is broken by the sound. But if you go a bit deeper, this haiku has a whole philosophy about life. The old pond is this earth. The frog represents living beings, and our life's purpose is to make us splash. There is silence before we are born, and there is silence after our death. The pond is still there. Okay, so let's learn about the history of haiku. Originally, haiku was the opening of a longer poem called renga, which was a collaborative poem by aristocrats. But later, they were written as an independent poem called hokku, but over the centuries, it evolved to become haiku. Generally, there are four great haiku masters who perfected the art: Matsuo Basho, Yosa Buson, Kobayashi Issa, and Masaoka Shiki. Basho brought Japanese poetry down to earth to make it accessible for the common folk. Buson turned haiku into serious philosophical poetry meditating the passage of time. Issa made haiku deep about life, suffering, and the human condition. Masaoka Shiki turned it into a serious art and gave us the name haiku. Now I'll tell you about them one by one. Matsuo Basho was born in 1644 in what's modern-day Mie Prefecture, southeast of Kyoto, into a land-owning peasant family with samurai privileges. I should point out that Mie is famous for ninjas, so it's possible that Basho came from a ninja family. Ninjas were sneaky spies who would move like shadow, while samurais were disciplined warriors who carried their swords openly. Ninjas were backstabbers, while samurais were frontstabbers. Not sure which is worse. Basho is sometimes compared to Shakespeare, who died 20 years before he was born. While both are poets, they couldn't be different. Shakespeare is known for his long, complex plays, while Basho is known for basically reinventing haiku, the shortest and simplest literary form in the world. He turned, why tell a story in 3 hours when you can do it in 3 lines? Your song caresses the depth of loneliness, O high mountain bird. As a young boy, Basho became a servant to Mr. Yoshidata, a wealthy man who was an avid fan of poetry called hokku. After the death of his master, Basho started publishing his own poems, which he refined into a serious art. In 1672, when he was 28, he moved to Edo, modern-day Tokyo, where he met other poets and literary-minded people. His unique poetic voice, simple yet potent, took Edo by storm. He would be invited to poetry events, rap battles, as well as people paid him money to learn from him. Now he was drenched in chains, full of swagger. He owned the narrow streets of Tokyo as the true gangster poet. Quote, breakfast enjoyed and the fine company of morning glories. But as there are ups and downs in life, in 1682, first his house burned down, and then a year later, his mother passed away. He threw away his chains and stopped going to rap battles and poetry meetings. Life sucked. Edo sucked. It was suffocating for him because the noise, the smoke, and the endless people. Basho was ready to end his life. But how do you do that? He decided to get lost. In those days, Japan was a dangerous place for solo travelers. Winter showers, even the monkey searches for a raincoat. In 1682, he became a full-time nomad. He started his journeys around Japan, wandering from town to town, village to village, in the hope of dying somewhere or getting killed by bandits or gangsters. As he traveled, he also wrote haiku. Through frozen rice fields, moving slowly on horseback, my shadow creeps by. But to his astonishment, his travels became his cure. Instead of getting chopped to pieces by bandits, he was rejuvenated. When water is stationary, it turns into a bog. When we humans are stationary, we live in our head. When we move, we live on the outside, surrounded by mountains, narrow roads, rice fields, strangers we meet, etc. So Basho was right to move out of Edo not only to get fresh air, but a new lease of life. It liberated him from the comfort of a modern life. All along this road, not a single soul, only autumn evening comes. He traveled far and wide as far as Kyoto. He was always on the move but also wrote haiku wherever he went. His 1694 book, Narrow Road to the Interior, is one of his best known books of his travels and poems. That same year, he began his last journey, heading to Kyoto and then Osaka, where he was taken ill and died at the age of 50. His death place is simply marked by an erect stone on the side of a very busy road. He was a traveler. His followers fulfilled his wish, buried him in Gichuji Temple near Lake Biwa, where his tomb is today. He composed this haiku in 1694, and that same year he died. Falling sick on a journey, my dream goes wandering on a withered field. Matsuo Basho, the pioneer, the old gangster, turned haiku into a true art with depth and a philosophy. He paved the road for future wanderers. 22 years after the death of Matsuo Basho, another haiku master was born in the same area where Basho died. Yosa Buson was born in 1716 in modern-day Osaka into a poor servant family. Just like Basho, aged 20, Buson moved to Edo, modern-day Tokyo, to study poetry. Inspired by Basho's book, The Narrow Road to the Interior, Buson began his own wanderings later on in life. Again, following in the footsteps of Basho, in 1744, Buson published his own travel diaries and poems. Utter aloneness, another great pleasure in autumn twilight. Aged 42, he got married and settled in Kyoto. Unlike Basho, he sat down at home to write haiku, and that's why he was more imaginative in his poetry, because he was sitting in his room imagining things, while Basho is a little more concrete as he traveled on the outside in the real world, so to speak. To give you a rap analogy, Basho was a wandering gangster, while Buson was a hood rapper. Buson wrote, "In this hood of mine, I hope I bear no likeness to the worldly scene." Buson's haikus also have a more philosophical, historical, and geographical tone to it, especially the passage of time and traditions. The reason for that is that he lived most of his later life in Kyoto, the most historical city in Japan, with traditions that were 1,000 years old. For example, in a bitter wind, a solitary monk bends to words cut in stone. A monk paying respect to those long gone, only their names carved on stone shows the passage of time, that so much has changed, yet the tradition of bowing to those who came before us continues. Fallen red blossoms from plum trees burst into flame among the horse turds. Buson was also a great painter, which adds to his imaginative mind. He died in 1784, aged 68. His tomb is in Konpukuji Temple in Kyoto's northeast, where Basho also stayed for a while. Goodbye, I will go alone down Kiso Road, old as autumn. Kobayashi Issa was born in 1763, 21 years after Buson died. Just like Basho and Buson, Issa is a pen name. He was born in what's modern-day Nagano Prefecture in the Alpine region of Japan. It's cold there. Issa's tough, miserable life gave his haiku a certain edge and sharpness. Here's an example. Everything I touch with tenderness, alas, pricks like a bramble. Before this autumn wind, even the shadows of mountains shudder and tremble. Aged 3, he lost his mother, so he was raised by his grandmother, but she too passed away when he was 14. Aged 15, following in the footsteps of Basho and Buson, he moved to Edo to find a job. Little is known about his life, but he was a wanderer just like Basho and Buson. He was also involved in legal battles with his stepmother after the death of his father over inheritance. Issa wrote about his mother. Mother, I weep for you as I watch the sea. Each time I watch the sea. Aged 49, he returned to his hometown and got married. This was a happy time for the man. Give me a homeland and a passionate woman, and winter alone. It was short-lived as he experienced tragedies after tragedies. He and his wife lost 5 children, all at a very young age. He wrote a haiku lamenting his bad luck. This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet. Issa wrote some 20,000 haiku, which was his refuge from the tragedies of life. He wrote this haiku after the death of his wife. If only she were here for me to nag tonight's moon. Issa was also a great artist, accompanying his haiku with a drawing. Issa himself died in 1828, age 64. Masaoka Shiki was born on the island of Shikoku in 1867, some 40 years after the death of Issa. Age 16, he moved to Tokyo. He is the modern master of haiku because in 1868, with a major restoration, Japan opened to the West and rapidly modernized, and Edo was named Tokyo, or Eastern Capital. Incidentally, Shiki was born in the same year as Natsume Soseki, who is the father of modern Japanese novels. They became close friends, and Soseki too wrote a lot of haiku. However, he is more famous for his novels. Shiki wasn't a diligent student, often failing his exams and getting into arguments and troubles. But one thing he was good at was playing baseball and writing haiku, which was perfect for someone suffering from attention deficit. He dropped out of university in 1892. Instead, he published his haiku book titled Talk on Haiku from the Author's Den. Now he didn't need to study because he was offered a job as a haiku editor. Unfortunately, in 1888, he contracted tuberculosis, just like Chekhov, Kafka, and Camus. Despite his health condition, in 1895, he went to China to cover the China-Japan War as a correspondent. As his condition worsened, he returned home and died in 1902, aged 34. Shiki wasn't just a writer of haiku, but also a reformer, a critic, and scholar of haiku. He took a very modern approach to haiku, making it into a serious literary form. Today, haiku is considered serious literature, not only in Japan, but around the world. But it wasn't the case back then, so thanks to Shiki's effort, haiku not only survived, but also thrived. Here are a few examples of Shiki's haikus. O autumn winds, for me there are no ancient gods, no Buddhas for me. After killing a spider, how lonely I feel in the cold of night. But why does it matter? Haiku has 2 important functions in Japan. It's a form of wabi-sabi. Wabi what?
Nani?
Wabi-sabi is simply put beauty in imperfection, or rustic beauty. Monet's water lilies are more beautiful than an actual pond because it gives you a simpler impression of the pond or lilies. Haiku is similar. It captures a kind of hidden beauty in nature and life. Wabi-sabi is an escape from flashiness, perfection, and symmetrical beauty. It lets you enjoy the imperfection. The second function of haiku is what is known in Japanese as muga, or self-forgetting. And the moment when we experience true beauty, we forget ourselves as we are in awe of what we experience. The term taking your breath away is perhaps a good way to explain this experience. When we see something beautiful, we almost forget to breathe. Once you forget yourself, you merge and become one with nature. In Buddhism, there's a concept of ego death, or a kind of self-forgetting that is only achieved in nirvana, when you are no longer controlled by your desires or ego. Haiku has other purposes too. It compresses and condenses time. It brings a mood of change like seasons. It eases tension through humor. But the main purpose of haiku is to bring you back down to nature, to be in the moment, in the here and now. So haiku is all about simplicity, but unfortunately life is not that simple. To make sense of it, some Japanese writers wrote novels in order to explain the complexity of modern life. In the next segment, I'll talk about Natsume Soseki, the father of modern Japanese novels, who captured the Japanese transition from the old to the new. Previously, I talked about the history of haiku, and the writer who bridges the haiku tradition with modern novel is none other than Natsume Soseki. He was a brilliant writer of haiku. Here's an example. Over the wintry forest, winds howl in rage with no leaves to blow. But today he's more famous for his novels and considered the father of modern Japanese literature. Natsume Soseki was born in 1867 in Tokyo, just a year before the city became the official capital of Japan and Meiji Emperor was moved from Kyoto to take over Japan during the Meiji Restoration, which opened Japan to modernization. Just as Charles Dickens captured the industrial age in England, Soseki did the same in Japan in his distinct comic tragic tone. At university, Soseki studied English and spent 2 years living in London, England, the city of Charles Dickens. Both Soseki and Dickens wrote about ordinary people's struggles and hardship. Both used comedy as a way of release from the suffocating hardship of ordinary life. Both are deeply revered in their respective countries. Upon his return from England in 1903, Soseki was inspired to write European-style novels, which didn't really exist in Japan. But he still continued writing haikus for magazines and newspapers which paid for his bills. But he spent most of his time writing long-form novels. His first novel, I Am a Cat, was published in 1905. A year later, in 1906, he published Bochan, another of his masterpieces. Now a famous writer, he quit his university job and became a full-time novelist. He became so productive that he wrote 1 or 2 novels a year. His other major novel was Kokoro, published in 1914. Unfortunately, in 1916, he suddenly died from a stomach ulcer. A century later, in 2016, Osaka University created a robot voiced by Soseki's grandson to give lectures in literature. Not just that, Soseki's brain is still preserved at Tokyo University, and his face is on the 1,000 yen note, the most circulated note in Japan. Now I'll discuss 3 of his most famous novels. Published in 1906, I Am a Cat is Soseki's most original novel in which the protagonist is a domestic cat belonging to a teacher. The use of an animal as a narrator gave Soseki a lot of freedom to poke fun at the Japanese middle class. It's about a cat who observes humans it encounters and captures the clash of the old versus the new quite beautifully. The cat uses very formal Japanese language, almost like an aristocrat, a little similar to the dog, Brian Griffin in The Family Guy. The unnamed feline narrator thinks very highly of himself, an intellectual and a snob who observes humans and passes on his own commentary and judgment about the absurd behaviors of these humans. Slowly, the cat's observations and judgments become increasingly philosophical, tackling questions like the nature of life, human urges, and existence itself. Being an outsider, the cat sees things from a fresh perspective. It depicts how humans are so peculiar and bizarre as we consider other animals' behavior. Quote, even the works of Shakespeare might be more thoroughly appreciated if they were re-examined from unorthodox positions. Someone once in a while should take a good long look at Hamlet through his legs. The novel is a social satire in which Soseki pokes fun at the Japanese middle class as well as intellectual elite who are so wrapped up in their own world that they see nothing funny about how they talk, behave, and scheme against one another. Soseki was writing at a time when the old elite, whose status was safeguarded by tradition, religion, and social class, was being challenged by the new elite, westernized, educated, and modern scientists and thinkers, as well as merchants. I Am a Cat is a bulky novel, and you might be surprised because cats usually have very little to say. Unless you're Soseki and give them a voice and they have plenty to talk about. Published in 1906, Bochan is Soseki's most taught novel in Japanese schools for two reasons. First, it's about a young man, Bochan, whose name means young master, who is at odds with everyone around him, which is relatable to us all because we all have experienced that we don't belong sometimes. The second reason it's favorite in Japanese schools is its comic tone. There are numerous scenes of comedy in the novel that make you laugh out loud. You can see early Dickensian influence on Soseki's writing, mainly in his sarcasm and irony in this novel. Just like Soseki himself, the story centers on Bochan's teaching experience on the island of Shikoku. He narrates his own story of childhood growing up in Tokyo, his troubles with neighbors and schoolmates, and finally his teaching position in a remote countryside. He's a free spirit in his language as well as his actions. Everyone thinks of him as a rascal, but the only person who finds him to be good is the family's servant, Kyo, who is his only ally, mother, and role model. Being a Tokyoite, Bochan is often careless, inconsiderate to other people's feelings, so he finds himself at odds with the teachers as well as the students. He's not scared of saying what is on his mind, and when others are shocked by his arrogance, he does not think he is the odd one out. Instead, he thinks others are the real rascals in the story. He dislikes everyone, and his only joy is going to hot springs and eating buckwheat noodles or soba. He gives his colleagues nicknames. For example, he calls the assistant head teacher Red Shirt, the English teacher Squash, and the maths teacher Porcupine. In school, Porcupine is his only ally. There's a lot of politics and scheming going on inside the school. There are a lot of plots plotted by teachers against other teachers. Bochan and Porcupine team up to bring the assistant head teacher Red Shirt down. They spy on him while he's visiting geisha girls. When confronted, the Red Shirt tells them they have no proof, so Bochan and Porcupine start punching him into submission. Bochan is old school and sees everything in black and white terms. His sense of justice is very strong, and when he sees injustice, he feels bothered to the point he wants to risk his job and relationships with others in order to correct the injustice. Some suggest that this novel shows the transition of Japan from the old feudal society where justice was served by individuals to a society with central government usurping such a role. Published in 1914, Kokoro is Soseki's best-selling novel, especially among younger readers. Kokoro in Japanese means heart, so it deals with love and relationship between a master and student, which is perhaps very unique to Japan. The first half of the novel is narrated by a young student who tells the story of his encounters with sensei or teacher, who remains unnamed. The second half of the novel is a confession of sensei himself. While in Kamakura on holiday, a young university student meets an older man whom he calls sensei, the Japanese word for master or teacher. They agree to meet again in Tokyo. Despite their continued meetings over the following months and years, there's always a distance between the two. You could say age difference, but there is something else. Sensei has a secret. He makes a monthly visit to a graveyard. But why? He doesn't want to talk about his dead friend. He says perhaps one day he can tell his story. After graduating university, the young narrator returns to his hometown to find his father ill and his family's finances in bad condition. He writes a letter to sensei asking for help in finding a job in Tokyo, but he gets no response. Months later, he receives a message from sensei asking him to return to Tokyo. But he cannot leave his ill father alone, so he refuses to go to Tokyo. A few days later, he receives a letter, but it's a thick one. We find that it is sensei's confession. But also there's a message about sensei might be dead by the time this letter arrives. This prompts the young man to head to Tokyo immediately. While on the train, he reads sensei's confession in full, which makes up the second half of the novel. Sensei's confession includes his existential crisis, his childhood in the countryside, loss of his parents, and inheriting an enormous wealth, and his subsequent struggles between family duties in the country and his studies in Tokyo. This resembles Soseki's own life in many ways. While studying in Tokyo, Sensei rents a room in a house owned by a Tokyo family. As it turns out, Sensei falls in love with the family's daughter. Afraid of rejection, he hesitates to ask the family for the daughter's hand in marriage. In the meantime, Sensei meets a friend named Kei who's struggling financially, so he asks his lodging family to give Kei a place to stay for a while. Now we have a love triangle. Sensei soon finds out that Kei has also fallen in love with the family's daughter. At one point, Kei confesses his love. This makes Sensei furious, but he keeps his cool and doesn't tell his friend about his own love for the same woman. Instead of telling the truth to his friend, Sensei plots to steal the girl behind his back. Sensei advises his friend to abstain from love and remain strong in his Buddhist principle, but at the same time he goes behind his friend's back to propose marriage to the same girl. When Kei finds out about Sensei's plot to snatch his lover away, he takes his own life. Sensei finds a note in which Kei blames him. Despite losing his friend, Sensei eventually marries the girl and decides to make a monthly visit to Kei's grave. But the guilt torments him from the inside. At the end of his confession, Sensei tells the young man to keep it all secret from his wife. Why? Sensei has decided to end his own life after writing this confession because he was responsible for the death of his friend, as well as loss of faith in humanity in general. So now, Sensei is no more. There have been a lot of different interpretations of this novel. Some attribute the nihilistic tone of the novel to the strong tradition of Japanese honor being challenged by a more individualistic Western life, which prompted Sensei to plot against his friend in his own selfish pursuit. While in London, Soseki witnessed how cold and individualistic the English people were, only responsible for yourself and your individual goals. In Japan, however, one's duty towards others was as important, if not more. Soseki witnessed the changes that were coming to Japan after the Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century, when Japan started to adapt Western science, technology, as well as the culture of individualism. Another important element of the novel is the old tradition of teacher-student relation, which was strong throughout the world. In ancient Greece, we see Socrates and Plato and Aristotle as great examples of teacher and student. In Japan, in schools and martial arts as well as creative arts, there was a deep connection between a master and a student. In Kokoro, there is no direct import of skills between Sensei and the young man, but there is a metaphorical connection. Sensei's confession is a sobering warning to the young man on how to go about his own life. The young man has a dying father, but his spiritual connection is with Sensei, who indirectly imparts wisdom about life, the nature of love, and friendship. Just as I said, Soseki's life and writing career coincided with Japan's rapid modernization starting in the second half of the 19th century. Soseki beautifully captured that dynamic transitional period when the old nobility class was slowly replaced by the new merchant class. This is why his writing is often very comedic, because the old aristocratic way of life was seen as archaic and funny to the new middle class in Japan. Just like Gogol in Russia a few decades earlier, Soseki poked fun at old Japan. But interestingly, the new culture replacing the old had also many flaws, one of them being ruthless individualism, which often went against honor and friendship. In I Am a Cat, Soseki introduces an animal to observe the absurdities of humans. In Bochan, he depicts the battle of the old versus the new. In Kokoro, he talks about how individualism has destroyed honor and integrity. Soseki was an artist of the floating world, the world in transition. He still studied Chinese literature and Japanese literature in tandem. The writers who came after him no longer looked to China as their ancestors had done for over 1,000 years. These writers look to the West, and the rest is history. In the next segment, I'll discuss another writer who, instead of novels, perfected the art of short stories to capture how old Japan crumbled like an earthquake that made you question the whole notion of the truth. Previously, I discussed Natsume Soseki, who introduced the modern novel to the Japanese. In this segment, I'll discuss another great author who grew up reading Soseki, whom he met in 1915, a year before Soseki died. But instead of novels, he revolutionized the art of short story as an anchor in a time when modernization was shifting the grounds beneath his feet. Ryunosuke Akutagawa was born in 1892 in Tokyo into a wealthy family in the midst of westernization of Japan. Ryunosuke Akutagawa is one of the most brilliant Japanese fiction writers of the 20th century who had a huge influence on many other Japanese writers. Between 1915 and until his death in 1927, Akutagawa wrote about 150 short stories. But on the inside, the man was tormented throughout his life. Quote, "I don't have the strength to keep writing this. To go on living with this feeling is painful beyond description. Isn't there someone kind enough to strangle me in my sleep?" He suffered from mental problems, more specifically his premonition and anxiety of inheriting his mother's insanity that drove him to take his own life in 1927, when he was only 35 years old. Despite his short life, he gave a unique perspective on the human condition through his many amazing short stories. Akira Kurosawa combined two of his most famous short stories in 1950s classic film Rashomon. Today, he is considered one of the most influential Japanese writers of all time. The Akutagawa Prize, one of the most prestigious literary prizes in Japan, is named after him. Now I'll tell you some of his stories. Published in 1915, Rashomon tells the story of a poor man and an old woman who meet at the old Rashomon Gate in Kyoto with a few ironic twists. They both live on the outside of the city wall as outcasts. Kyoto City back in those days as a capital attracted a lot of people from all over Japan, so a lot of the poor immigrants as well as local lived a tough life. When they died, their bodies were dumped outside the gates. Today, there are two temples built in the Arashiyama area to remember those abandoned souls with simple stones as well as small statues. The man who has recently been fired from his job has a dilemma, whether to starve to death or become a thief. Among the corpses, something catches his eyes. He notices something moving. Intrigued, he goes closer to see an old woman stealing hair from the dead bodies to sell in the market for a few pennies. Seeing how morally low she has sunk, he decides he would rather starve than steal. But before he leaves, they have a chat. He questions her morality. She explains that stealing is the only option for survival. When your own life is on the line, you gotta do what keeps you alive. Also, the woman justifies her actions, saying that she is stealing from the corpse of a woman who used to sell snakes, telling people it was fish. The man says, "By your logic, I have every right to take your clothes in order to survive because I'm starving." She has no moral defense, so the man strips her off her robe and also kicks her when she resists and disappears into the night, leaving the old woman without her clothes and possibly condemning her to death. Here, Akutagawa juxtaposes morality with the harsh reality of life. The servant wanted to uphold the law, choosing starvation over stealing. But the dialogue with the woman transformed him right there and then into someone opposite to his own self a few moments later. Akutagawa doesn't take side, merely depicting how real life happens. How a simple interaction between two people changes a man beyond recognition. We are malleable creatures, always capable of change. As Nietzsche said, we are not human beings, but human becoming. Published in 1916, The Nose is inspired by Nikolai Gogol's 1836 short story of the same title. It tells the story of a high-ranking Buddhist priest of a Heian period in Kyoto whose long nose gives him a lot of trouble. Back then, your appearance was extremely important as he was close to the royal court. So he is obsessed with his nose, always standing in front of a mirror like an Instagram influencer. His only hope is to find someone with a longer nose so he doesn't stand out. One day, one of his students tells him about a new Chinese technique of shrinking the nose. At first, the priest pretends his nose is not an issue, but later he goes through the unorthodox nose job. The medical technique is pretty old school, which includes boiling the nose, stomping on it in order to remove its fat tissue. It works. The priest's nose is still hooked, but much smaller than before. He's happy, so he proudly walks outside without trying to hide it. Now here's a twist in the tale. His nose reduction backfires. Before, at least people respected him, but now everyone on the outside laughs at him. Before, nobody brought it to his face, but now everyone is quite brazenly mocking him. This annoys him so much that he vents his anger at his students. Now, not only he has lost respect, his nose is openly mocked. He wishes he had never gone through the nose job. Things really get worse for him until one morning he wakes up to find himself with his original long, ugly nose. He's finally happy. Now he can return to his old self. When nature deals you a card, accept it like a true Buddhist. This story should be readily available in all plastic surgery clinics. I say Simon Cowell should have read it. Akutagawa, just like Google, shows how fragile the human mind is. The nose becomes the sum total of a person's entire being. In other words, all his effort is put into keeping his nose as inconspicuous as possible, but it becomes an elephant in any room he goes into. As someone rises up the ranks socially on the outside, his psychological vanity on the inside becomes even more fragile. Published in 1922, In a Grove, sometimes called In a Bamboo Grove, is Akutagawa's most profound short story. In the form of court documents, it tells the story of a murder of a samurai inside a bamboo forest in Kyoto, in which 7 people give somewhat contradictory accounts of the murder. First, a woodcutter who discovers the body tells the police he didn't see any weapon, but only a comb, a piece of rope, and a sign of struggle. Second, a priest tells the police that he saw an armed man and veiled woman on a horse heading east of Kyoto. The third person who testifies is an ex-criminal now employed by the police. He has caught a criminal named Tajomaru who has the weapons belonging to the victim. Also, Tajomaru has killed people before. The fourth person to testify is an old woman who identifies the victim as his son-in-law and tells the police that his daughter is the veiled woman and now missing. The first 4 people are mere witnesses, but the next 3 people all claim to have killed the man, but only one can be true. The first person to confess to the murder is the criminal, Tajomaru. He tells the police that he lured the couple into the bamboo grove by talking about some hidden treasure. Once there, he attacked the woman first, but later had a duel with a man which resulted in his death. The woman, however, fled the scene and he never saw her again. He says he accepts the punishment that comes his way. The second person to confess to the murder is the missing woman herself, who tells the police that she killed her husband after being raped by Tajomaru because their relationship was over and she couldn't look her husband in the eyes anymore. The third person to confess to the killing is the ghost of the victim, who through a medium tells that he killed himself after seeing his wife having sex with another man. In this story, Akutagawa tries to question the concept of truth as something solid, concrete, and objective. In the legal system, as well as science, we rely on facts and truths. However, Akutagawa shows us that the path is not always clear. When you are inside a bamboo grove, when all the trees look alike, you do get bamboozled and discombobulated, and truth slips away. Today we live in big, crowded cities. As a result, we lose a sense of autonomy or a strong sense of ourselves, which may result in us sometimes losing our grip on reality or truth. In big, crowded cities, we become part of an urban organism, just like being inside a bamboo forest or a shoal of fish. Sometimes we lose our individuality and become part of a giant urban jungle. Thus, we get confused or get fused together with others, so we cannot recognize the truth. This is why many witnesses to a crime fail to tell a coherent account of the incident they witnessed. So, humans are not always reliable in conveying what actually happened in reality. So, Akutagawa's short story, In a Grove, shows that sometimes we may never know the truth. One of the most important characteristics of Akutagawa is the juxtapositions of two opposing things. Akutagawa's stories deal with opposites such as truth and untruth, artistic creativity and dangerous obsession, heaven and hell, honesty and dishonesty, imagination and reality are all separated by a thin line like Taoist yin and yang. I should point out that Taoism came to Japan through Zen Buddhism, so it has seeped into the culture so much that people try to avoid social confrontation at all costs. Akutagawa also juxtaposes old Japanese fairy tales with modern or foreign stories like Gogol's The Nose as an example, in which he takes Russian inspiration and applies to old Japan. Another element of juxtapositions between men and women. In his stories, men and women often play each other's roles. We see more strong women and weaker men. In his story, The Life of a Stupid Man, he confessed his own shortcoming as a man who struggled with psychological issues, thus considered himself as an inadequate man. The women in his life had to take over where he lacked. As a writer, he was at home almost domesticated, which wasn't the norm for most Japanese men at the time who worked outside. Another element of Akutagawa's writing is his objective storytelling. He doesn't take a side and often leaves the judgment to the reader. Like Anton Chekhov, the Russian genius storyteller, he provides us with the facts of the story without judging the characters, or sometimes he simply asks questions without offering any answers. In other words, he writes about the reality of what is rather than what should be. This somewhat unbiased approach resonates with a lot of people as it allows you to see things from an artist's point of view. Another element of Akutagawa's writing is his structure. His stories follow a typical form but without a clear plot. We meet his characters without knowing who they are and what happened to them after the story ends. In other words, his characters are exposed through the main event. At the beginning, we see them one way, but after the event, we see them in a completely different light. In real life too, we do not know people until we see them struggle. The way someone solves a problem tells everything about that person. Just like a haiku that expresses a moment in time, a feeling in reaction to outside stimuli like seasonal changes, Akutagawa used single events to bring a slice of life to expose something about the human condition. Akutagawa's own mental struggle also played a role in his writing. Haruki Murakami speculates that Akutagawa was writing in order to escape the terrible anxiety of madness being passed on to him from his mother. It is often a cliché that most artists tend to have mental issues. In his case, it was the fear of mental illness that heightened his sense of and sharpened his focus to write deep and profound stories. Quote, "Life is more hellish than hell itself." In other words, the anxiety of waiting for something terrible can be far worse than the actual event itself. The fear of death is far more stressful than death itself. In his case, it was the fear of mental illness that ultimately defeated him. Today, Akutagawa's short stories are read in schools throughout Japan, and almost every Japanese person is familiar with his stories. His name has been adopted into anime and manga and is highly revered in Japan for capturing the mood of the early decades of the 20th century. Akira Kurosawa's masterpiece Rashomon, based on two of his stories, is one of the most influential movies of all time. not just in Japan but throughout the world. So it's safe to say Akutagawa was a genius artist who captured the anxiety and trepidation of Taisho period modernization, that the new replaced the old. In the next segment, we move away from short stories to talk about one of the most Japanese of all Japanese writers. Just like the old gangster Murasaki Shikibu, who looked nostalgically to the old Japan. In the previous segment, I talked about Akutagawa, who introduced the art of short stories to the Japanese audience and also captured the anxiety of Taisho period when the old Japan gave way to a more westernized Japan. In this segment, I'll introduce a writer who looked nostalgically to the old Japan and lamented how modernization ruined the old. Yasunari Kawabata was the first Japanese to win the Nobel Prize in 1968. Born in 1899 in Osaka, he lost both of his parents at a young age, so he was raised by his grandparents, which perhaps heightened his sympathy for the old. Just like Soseki and Akutagawa, he went to university to study English. However, perhaps influenced by Rabindranath Tagore's Nobel Prize of 1913, the first Asian to do so, as well as the Bengali giant's praise of Japan, Kawabata switched from English to Japanese literature. In an ironic twist, he became the first Japanese to win the Nobel Prize a few decades later. Kawabata had two major successes. First, in 1926, the short story The Dancing Girl of Izu was a massive success, and even today it's read by almost all Japanese school children. His second major success happened 10 years later with the publication of his masterpiece, Snow Country, which brought international fame that resulted in his 1968 Nobel Prize. Unlike his peers, he didn't take part in political debates or activities. Instead, he lived a somewhat recluse life, first in Asakusa, in a quiet suburb of Tokyo, and then in Kamakura, a seaside town some 50 kilometers southeast of Tokyo. 4 years after winning the Nobel Prize in 1972, Kawabata died after a gas leak. It is not confirmed whether it was a deliberate act or accident. Just like in his novels and stories, the ending is never clear, and that's also true in his own life. From 1926 until his death in 1972, Kawabata wrote 50 novels and novellas. Published in 1926, The Dancing Girl of Izu tells the story of a 14-year-old girl from Izu who falls in love with a 20-year-old student from Tokyo. This short story is such a phenomenon that a train, the Izu dancer, is named after one of its main characters, and nearly every Japanese person has read it. The story is about a student from Tokyo who visits the Izu Peninsula. While there, he meets a band of traveling dancers. He falls in love with the youngest girl because he finds her to be the most innocent and naive of the bunch. He tries to find excuses to prolong his stay with the band, while also being careful not letting them suspect his feelings. As the story progresses, he finds out more about the girl. Once he finds out her age, he realizes their age difference would make their love almost impossible. He takes this news as a sigh of relief. At least he can now move on. Move on he does. It's time he returns to Tokyo to study, but uncertain he will ever meet her again. It's like leaving your heart behind. How about the girl? Is she in love with him too? Nobody captures the untold emotion better than Kawabata. We only find out about her feelings when he announces his departure for Tokyo. Hearing this news, the teenage girl feels her entire world has collapsed. Her subtle, fragile, and innocent love is captured here beautifully. It's perhaps one of the most well-written short stories about teenage love ever. Heartbreaking, but also beautiful. Published in 1937, Snow Country, or Yukiguni in Japanese, Kawabata's most well-known novel is about Shimamura, a wealthy Tokyo businessman who escapes his hectic life in Tokyo to relax in a snowy spa town in Niigata in the north of Japan. While there, he gets enamored with two young geishas. Shimamura is like a modern-day Prince Genji, unable to settle down with one woman. As the story progresses, he is involved with three women, his wife in Tokyo and the two geisha girls in the spa town. The novel basically boils down to a battle between one man and three women. The novel begins with one of the most beautiful scenes. Shimamura is on a train to the spa town and catches the reflection of a young geisha girl superimposed on the plains outside through the train window in the evening light. He's so embarrassed to stare at her directly, but watches her reflection projected on the plains and mountains on the outside. It turns out this very girl, whose name is Yoko, lives with Komako, the geisha he is visiting. Shimamura and Komako know each other from before when she was a trainee geisha. But seeing Yoko for the first time, he's in love with her too. But his love is slightly different with a younger geisha. He doesn't want to ruin it by becoming physical with her. He simply wants to admire her from a distance, just as he was admiring her projected reflection through the window of the train. This is how Kawabata describes her. Quote, "The high, thin nose was a little lonely, a little sad, but the bud of her lips opened and closed smoothly like a beautiful little circle of leeches." Kawabata captures the thin line between the beauty of romance and the ugliness of betrayal. The bulk of the novel is about Komako's backstory, how she became a geisha and her care for an older man who is sick. While the spa town is blissful and romantic, there's a little terrible tragedy at the end. A fire breaks out and unfortunately Yoko, the young geisha, is one of its casualties. At the end, Komako rushes to help Yoko, her romantic rival, as she tumbles down from a burning building. Shimamura just watches with his arms folded. Here the novel ends. Kawabata's Snow Country is a story of love, broken hearts, unreturned promises, and unrequited love. You could say that in this novel, beauty is only preserved if it's not touched. That's the paradox of life. Published in 1951, The Master of Go is perhaps the only novel that seems complete. Kawabata was also happy with the novel. The story is about a legendary game of Go between two great masters. For those who don't know, Go is a board game with black and white pieces, a little similar to chess, and is highly strategic, played in Japan, Korea, and China. The main plot of the novel is about an older master being challenged by a younger, upcoming master, a theme very common in all world's epics. This generational divide is depicted with older strategies coming face to face with new strategies. The novel hones in on the psychological side of the game, what goes on inside the head of each player like some pressure cooker. As expected, the young challenger wins the game and sadly the older player dies barely a year after that grueling game. It just shows the nature of life, younger generations replacing the old, and the cycle continues. This theme of old being replaced by the new is more prominent in Kawabata's next novel. Published in 1962, The Old Capital is Kawabata's love letter to the city of Kyoto, where Japan has kept its old traditions but now under immense threat from modernization. The bulk of the novel is about Kyoto, its beautiful streets, colorful festivals, and fleeting seasons, especially autumn when leaves separate from trees. The story is about a twin separated at a young age and raised in contrasting economic classes, one in a poor village while the other in city in a wealthy family. Their sudden reunion during one of Kyoto's numerous festivals shocks a suitor who is puzzled by how similar the two girls look. Once they learn about each other, a deep affection starts to grow between the two girls. But their contrasting upbringings make it hard to bridge the socio-economic class gap between them. The village girl refuses any offer of help or reunion and is adamant that she doesn't want to bother her well-off sister, despite the other begging her. In her head, she thinks she would be bothering her wealthy sister, so she refuses to join her. Within a Confucian hierarchical culture, everyone knows their place, so the poor sister sticks to her station in life. She accepts the card life has dealt her. Apart from the main plot, the novel's other protagonist is Kyoto itself, battling modernization in an attempt to keep its traditions. For example, traditional kimono designers are losing the battle against more modern, up-to-date businesses that produce cheap, colorful, shiny alternatives using machines. Human fingers are no match to machines' claws that move at a beastly speed. Kawabata laments how the world is changing and leaving the past behind. Why Kawabata? Unlike other Japanese writers who adopted a more Western style of storytelling, Kawabata returned to the Tale of Genji, a thousand-year-old novel by Shikibu Murasaki. Both authors capture the subtlety of Japanese life, where not everything is verbalized. In the Japanese psyche, beauty is felt, not explained or analyzed, so even today, communication is often non-verbal, and silence is not as uncomfortable. In Kawabata's novel, things are implied. For example, in a scene in the snow country, Shimamura refers to Komako as woman instead of girl, just like Britney Spears. This simple wording means a huge deal for the geisha because now she thinks she is no longer a viable love interest for Shimamura because she is old. Kawabata's style of writing resembles an impressionist painting. It's no surprise that the Japanese art had a big influence on impressionist artists like Monet. Being subtle and vague adds to the beauty. Kawabata also avoids too much description, so his novels are all very short and to the point. Most of his novels can be read in one sitting, but they capture the melancholy of human life and how fleeting everything is, which in Japan, this concept is called mono no aware. Nothing lasts forever. Not only is there no happy ending in Kawabata's works, there is no ending either. Kawabata left most of the novels unfinished, which makes reading them a bit frustrating as we don't know what really happens at the end. Nothing is resolved, romances remain unrequited, and the distance between two lovers rarely bridged. But for a serious reader, it's a beautiful depiction of life. In other words, it's more beautiful when two lovers miss one another rather than meet one another. Life goes on after every failure and triumph. Even Kawabata's own death remains a mystery. Perhaps we will never find out. Despite our thirst for clarity, life offers very little clarity. It is an endless subtlety, nuance, and unachieved goals. Kawabata captures that beautifully. In the next segment, we move away from the fleeting beauty of old Japan to a darker place where failure, shame, and humiliation that the 1945 Japanese surrender to the Allied forces brought are so deeply felt by our next author that he felt he was no longer human. In the previous segment, I discussed how Kawabata lamented the old Japan being rapidly replaced by changes that modernization brought. In this segment, we enter a darker world when the two atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Osamu Dazai's novel, No Longer Human, is considered one of the most disturbing novels ever written. But who was Dazai and why did he write this novel? Born in 1909 into a wealthy land-owning family, Dazai was drawn to works by Ryunosuke Akutagawa as well as Fyodor Dostoevsky. As we will see later, there are a lot of similarities in his novel and Dostoevsky's notes from Underground. In 1923, his father died of lung cancer, and 4 years later, his idol Akutagawa took his own life in 1927. Age 35. These events shook the young man, so he went into kind of withdrawal mode. These events shook the young man so much so that he went to a kind of withdrawal mode. Not only that, he made an attempt to end his life in 1929, but he was unsuccessful. A few years later, he tried again and failed again. But this time, it resulted in the drowning of a barmaid whom he had convinced to join him in his attempt. To escape prosecution, his influential family intervened and the police dropped all charges. To numb the pain of existence, he joined the underground Communist Party. Not only that, he turned to alcohol, sex, and later morphine. His involvement with the communists alerted the police, and again his family helped him avoid jail time. Now exhausted from everything else, he turned to writing. While bombs were falling on Tokyo, Dazai continued writing. Just as Paris was the scene of war in Proust's time during World War I, Dazai's own home was burned during the American bombing. But it didn't stop him from writing and publishing. In the aftermath of the atomic bombs dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, Dazai's dark psychological writing resonated with the mood of the nation, defeated, humiliated, and occupied by their enemies. Suddenly, Dazai became extremely popular because everyone felt his pain, everyone connected with stories of a man who was lost, humiliated, and a man who had attempted to end his life 3 times. In 1947, he wrote and published The Setting Sun, in reference to Japan's name as the nation of the rising sun. In other words, in 1947, the sun wasn't rising anymore. It was the nation of setting sun. As a young man, Dazai was a communist who wanted to eradicate the old system, tradition, and of course, the establishment. Now in his late 30s, he was a fierce supporter of Japanese royal family and its past aristocratic glories. The circle was complete. A radical young man was looking back nostalgically at the past glories of his nation. Just as Dostoevsky turned against the westernization of Russia, Dazai too wanted Japan to return to its former glories. In 1948, he published his most famous novel, which is mostly known outside Japan. No Longer Human was his last attempt to tell a story of a man utterly humiliated and defeated, so much so that he no longer considers himself part of the human race. A year earlier, he abandoned his own family and moved in with another woman, a war widow. In 1948, the two of them drowned themselves in a nearby canal in Tokyo. He was 38 years old. Today, Dazai is read in Japan. Most of his readers are young people. While his writing has dark themes, they are very relatable to a lot of people. He is honest, direct, and his style is down to earth. Published in 1948, No Longer Human is also translated as A Shameful Life. In Japanese, it's called Ningen Shikaku. Ningen means human and shikaku means disqualified, incapacitated, or eliminated. In a more simple term, basically, it means a human loser. While the politics of the time is not the focus of this novel, one cannot help associate the theme of the novel with the psychological impact of 1945 on the Japanese psyche, especially men proud of their samurai history, but now under the US occupation. Defeat and humiliation can be felt in this novel. Despite his dark themes, the novel is so popular among young people that recently a manga artist, Junji Ito, adopted it into a best-selling manga. The manga is a bit stretched to 3 volumes, focusing more on horror themes, while the original novel is very short and philosophical. No Longer Human tells the story of Oba Yozo, the protagonist who feels no longer human. The story comes to us in a collection of 3 notebooks written by Yozo himself, but brought to us by an unnamed narrator who has also seen 3 photos of Yozo. The story comes to us in a collection of 3 notebooks written by Yozo himself, but brought to us by an unnamed narrator who has also seen 3 photos of Yozo. That's all we have, 3 pictures and 3 notebooks. From a very young age, Yozo realizes a simple fact. He thinks he doesn't belong to the society he lives in, like an imposter or a runaway child. In order to survive in this tribe, he must pretend. He must fake it to make it. Yozo has 2 masks or 2 personas. First is through duty. Since he doesn't want others to question him, he does what others ask him to do, not to rock the boat. For him, life is like a play, like an ancient Japanese performing art called No, in which all actors wear masks, or the French masquerade. Everything we do in life is an act. The second mask he wears is his comedy. He acts like a clown so nobody takes him seriously. Since Yozo's entire life is an act, his deepest fear is that someone might unmask him. 2 incidents shake him deeply. One in school, while jumping during a sports class, on purpose he falls down to make others laugh. Another student, Takaichi, becomes suspicious. The second incident is at a police station when an officer asks him if his coughing blood was fake. Both incidents are incredibly frightening for him. Quote, "The more I feared people, the more I was liked. And the more I was liked, the more I feared them, a process which eventually compelled me to run away from everybody." Afraid his secrets might be revealed, he becomes friends with Takaichi, who introduces him to the works of Vincent van Gogh, the artist with a troubled soul. For a while, art becomes his Freudian catharsis. He also thinks that art is the closest thing without any material utility. He dislikes anything that has a purpose. Quote, "Mine has been a life of much shame. I can't even guess what it must be to live a life of a human being. I was born in a village in the northeast, and it wasn't until I was quite big that I saw my first train. I climbed up and down the station bridge quite unaware that its function was to permit people to cross from one track to another. I was convinced that the bridge had been provided to lend an exotic touch and to make the station premises a place of pleasant diversity, like some foreign playground. I remained under this delusion for quite a long time, and it was for me a very refined amusement indeed to climb up and down the bridge. I thought it was one of the most elegant services provided by the railways. When later I discovered that the bridge was nothing more than a utilitarian device, I lost all interest in it." As a young man, Yozo heads to Tokyo to study at Tokyo University, just like Dazai himself. While in Tokyo, he has some freedom from his family's servants. One of his classmates in art class introduces him to alcohol. Not just that, he also discovers sex and politics. He divides his time between chasing prostitutes for release of his sexual urge and attending underground communist meetings for tribal belonging. Both leave him empty at the end. Inside the Communist Party, he rises up the ranks quickly simply because he does what he is told to do. In other words, he's a perfect cog in this machine, but deep down he has little interest in the ideology itself. At some point, he gets fed up with his life. He convinces a barmaid to drown together. Just as it happened to Dazai, the woman drowns while Yozo survives with enormous guilt. He's arrested, but due to his family's enormous political influence, he's released. But he's kicked out of university. Later, he meets Shizuko, a single mother, and they start living together. He pretends to be her husband and the father to her child. All is fake, of course. That's Yozo's life, it's all fake. Perhaps now, this responsibility of being a father to a child can give him a purpose? The answer is no. Old habits return. He spends his days drawing cartoons for a newspaper, and at night he drinks and womanizes like there is no tomorrow. His days and nights spill over each other. He draws pictures of naked women and copies the poetry of Omar Khayyam underneath. Khayyam, the Persian poet, was writing centuries ago about life being too short, so you might as well drink and have fun as a kind of rebellion against strict Islamic religious authorities. Later, Yozo meets a young lady called Yoshiko, a virgin girl who's extremely innocent and trusting, the total opposite to Yozo, who trusts nobody. You could say a perfect match. Things are looking up for Yozo. He's finally happy. But his past catches up to him. An old friend, Haruki, former art classmate, the man who introduced him to the hedonistic life of drinking and womanizing, comes to visit him. While Yoshiko is downstairs cooking a meal for them, the two men are upstairs catching up. They talk about life, art, and of course literature. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment comes up. This is an ominous sign that something terrible is about to happen. But Yozo is totally oblivious. He's finally happy thanks to Yoshiko. His heart is filled with love. But Haruki is a different beast. Next thing you know, Haruki goes downstairs and sexually assaults Yoshiko. Yozo is devastated. It was his fault for letting the man get close to Yoshiko. His guilt is enormous. This incident prompts him to end his life for the second time, but he fails once again. Speaking of being a loser who cannot succeed in anything. While recovering at the hospital, he discovers a miracle drug, morphine. We know where that ends. He ends up in a mental asylum. After a while, he's taken up by his brother to a remote countryside. We don't know what happens to him there, but we know how he feels about life. By the end of the novel, he says he's 27 years old, but he thinks he looks like 40. The narrator refers to Yozo as a madman, but even he has no idea what happened to him at the end. There are no more notebooks from Yozo, so it can only mean one thing. Perhaps he's no longer around. The no longer human is no longer, perhaps. One of the most common themes in Japanese literature is loneliness. A country with about 120 million people is perhaps the loneliest country in the world. Isolated from its neighbors through bodies of water on all sides, speaks a language that nobody else speaks, practices Shintoism, a religion that nobody else practices, ethnically unrelated to any other countries and culturally extremely unique. Not only the country is isolated, but the people are too. Among the Japanese, social interactions are regimented. You only talk to people if you have a genuine reason or a relationship. Casual interactions with strangers is rare. Most Japanese people live in one-bedroom apartments. Marriage rate is falling, birth rate is falling. It's estimated that by the end of this century, Japan will have 73 million people. So it's no surprise that loneliness is one of the most common themes in Japanese literature. Through the influence of Chinese philosopher Confucius, individualism is not promoted. Yozo tried his best to fit in through comedy as well as through duty, but it came at a cost. He wasn't himself, he was pretending. The fear of being found out takes its toll after a while. Hiding his true self leads Yozo to paranoia. He tried art as a cure, painting portraits and cartoons, but art too failed to give him a proper purpose. Instead, he fell for short-term hedonistic pleasures. He found women, alcohol, and drugs as quick solution to his inner miseries. Women as savior of fallen men is prominent in Dostoevsky's work, and here too we see a few times women came to rescue Yozo. But his relationships with women are not great. At times he loves them, but then he realizes that men and women are vastly different. Quote, I've always found that the female of the human species is many times more difficult to understand than the male. In the immediate family, women outnumber the men. I think it will be no exaggeration to say that my only playmates while I was growing up were girls. Nevertheless, it was with very much the sensation of treading on thin ice that I associated with these girls. I could almost never guess their motives. I was in the dark. At times I made indiscreet mistakes which brought me painful wounds. These wounds, unlike the scars from the lashing a man might give, cut inwards very deep, like an internal hemorrhage, bringing intense discomfort. Once inflicted, it was extremely hard to recover from such wounds. Yozo says that men inflict you physical pain while women inflict emotional pain. For example, the same woman would throw him under the bus in front of others, but later in private hug him. Another example is when he was clowning himself, men would laugh at him for a short while. Women, however, would nudge and prod him to continue making jokes, and they would continue laughing, which led him to conclude that women's desire for excitement has no limit. One of the biggest ironies in the story is that despite his negative view of women, they fall for him. Perhaps these women saw this miserable man as a project. I should point out that Yozo is a good-looking man, another reason women were attracted to him. He's no different than a stray cat in a park, and many women feed them and look after them. Every time he's rescued by a woman, just like a wild cat, he goes astray. Apart from sex, alcohol, and drugs, Yozo also dabs into politics. Just like Dostoevsky joined the radical left-wing group in his younger days before his Siberian experience, Yozo too joins a communist circle. The novel is mainly set in the early 1930s when Japan was going through rapid westernization and imperial expansion. The old and the new felt like a mismatch for many young writers, including Dazai, Akutagawa, and Mishima. In the same way, a century earlier, for the first generation of Russian writers like Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, and to some extent Dostoevsky wrote against the westernization of Russia. While Dazai's novels and stories may sound depressing, reading him somewhat uplifting at times. First, his style of writing is very relatable as most of his writing is in diary form. It's like we are reading someone's most private thoughts and feelings, confessions, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses. We sympathize with his characters and we relate with them. This makes us feel not alone. We understand Yuzo's pains and that makes us less lonely. In the next segment, I'll go deeper into the pessimism of the post-war Japan by discussing one of the most important novels of alienation in Japanese literature. In the previous segment, I discussed one of the darkest novels of Japanese literature and how Dazai captured the mood of the nation in the aftermath of 1945 atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this segment, we go deeper on the theme of alienation by talking about Kobo Abe's masterpiece, The Woman in the Dunes. Kobo Abe's novel, The Woman in the Dunes, depicts the meaninglessness of the human condition through the eyes of a man stuck in sand like some Kafkaesque nightmare. We often see insects trapped in a web. In this novel, it is us humans who are trapped like insects. Kobo Abe was born in Tokyo in 1924, exactly a century ago. He grew up in Manchuria in the northeast of China, back then under the control of the Japanese army. He considered himself a man with no hometown. Due to his early alienation from Japan, he turned to collecting insects, doing maths, and reading literature, especially Dostoevsky and Kafka, as well as German philosophy like Nietzsche or Heidegger. Just like Dr. Chekhov, Abe enrolled to study medicine, but in his spare time he wrote short stories and novels. Just like Dazai, Camus, and many other novelists, Abe joined the Communist Party. But being an artist, Abe was sure to find it tough to conform to the rigid rules of the party. In 1951, he won a major literary prize, the Akutagawa Prize. In 1962, he published his greatest novel, The Woman in the Dunes, which made him famous around the world. He published 15 novels, over 20 short story collections, 19 plays, 2 poetry collections, and dozens of essays. He died in 1993, aged 68. But around the world, his most famous novel is The Woman in the Dunes. Published in 1962, The Woman in the Dunes is about Junpei Nikki, a Tokyo schoolteacher whose hobby is to collect insects. On one of his insect collection adventures, there's an ironic twist. Instead of trapping and collecting insects, he himself becomes trapped like an insect. It's a stranger comes to village kind of story. Abe himself felt an outsider because he grew up in Manchuria, so he felt he wasn't the real Japanese and not really Chinese either. Just like Camus growing up in Algeria, but not really Algerian. The theme of being outsider is very prominent in Abe's works, just as it is in Camus' works, the famous The Stranger. While visiting a remote countryside to find rare insects, Junpei misses the last bus back to town. But it's all good because the villagers are incredibly friendly and hospitable. They give him accommodation in a house. He thinks nothing of it and is happy that he has a spot for the night, unaware that it's not going to be for one night, but a lifetime. The first ominous sign is a rope that leads him down into the house. He thinks nothing of it. It's a remote village after all. The second bad sign is the woman who lives in the house. She talks very little. The insect collector thinks she must be shy. Again, he thinks nothing of it. He's very grateful that he's been given accommodation for the night. He goes to bed almost oblivious to everything. The next morning, however, everything changes for him. The first thing he notices is the absence of the ladder. The house is in a pit and the only way out is via the ladder, but it's gone. Now he feels like an insect inside a pitcher plant. Not only is there no way out, he's also expected to work. The villagers have a very simple existence. At night, the sand falls onto their house and during the day, their job is to clear the sand. That's it. Since the sand is endless, so is their work. Quote, sand, which didn't even have a form of its own, yet not a single thing could stand against its shapeless, destructive power. The very fact that it had no form was doubtless the highest manifestation of its strength, was it not? Junpei also gets the message that his second job is to make babies with the woman. Yes, he has to clear the sand and make babies. Those are his life's missions. At first, he is incredulous, and in the back of his mind, he thinks this must be a joke, so he attempts to escape. But all comes to nothing. It slowly dawns on him that his Kafkaesque nightmare is real. It is his fate. He must accept it. At some point, he realized that even if he returns to his life in Tokyo, he would still have a similar existence. While in the village, he tries to be useful. He devises a novel way to collect water, which gives him a sense of fulfillment. Back in Tokyo, 7 years passes and he doesn't show up, so finally he is officially declared dead. One of the most unique things about this novel is its setting, a remote village covered in sun, just like some remote villages near the Gobi Desert. Most of Abe's novels are set in the city. I think the desert setting gives it a bit of isolation, and its minimalism gives it a bit of clarity so you can see things without much distractions of an urban environment. In cities, we are stimulated so that we get lost, so it's hard for us to reflect or have a clear aerial view of our own existence. In a sandy desert, nothing distracts you. Camus' existentialist novel, The Stranger, was also set on a sandy beach in Algeria. The novel depicts life and growing up. When young, we have an idealistic view of the world. We think we are able to change it. But as we grow up, we slowly succumb to the realities of life. We get a job, get married, and become a creature of habit. Life is not some adventurous journey for most people. It's full of toils, monotony, repetition, and above all, it's never free. Life is about duties. If you don't clear the sand from your house, nobody else will. So Kobo Abe articulates the human condition from a distance. If some aliens watched each and every one of us, they would come to the same conclusion. We all live in a village or a high-rise apartment block, and we get up in the morning, go to work, come back, and to repeat it the same the next day. The Buddhist notion that life is nothing but suffering is apparent in many Japanese novels. In Buddhism, even the idea of self is nothing but an illusion as we go through the cycle of reincarnation. Sand is a perfect metaphor for how fragile human identity is. It's constantly shifting as we age. When young, we are idealistic, but as we age, we accept reality more and more. We look at insects stuck in a spider web or a pitcher plant, we are no different ourselves. Perhaps insects are smarter than us as they don't question the meaning of life. They just get on with life. Published in 1964, 2 years after the publication of The Woman in the Dunes, The Face of Another is also about a man alienated from society. The format, Notebooks Left Behind, is very similar to No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, which was published 6 years earlier. The story is about a man named Okuyama, a scientist whose face is severely burned in an accident. He's so repulsive that his wife refuses to have sex with him. But Mr. Okuyama, the scientist, is very resourceful. He's a plastic scientist. He manages to create a new face for himself, a mask that makes him beautiful again. Today in Hollywood, it's hard to find someone who has no plastic in their face. But in the 1960s, people only used plastic for cups, not on their face or breasts. His new face charms the wife. Now their newfound romantic adventures are as crazy as the man's new face. Not only does he get to sleep with his wife, he also sees the world in a new, unique way. Our face is not only how others see us, but it also reflects the world in a unique way. For instance, the world is a much nicer place if you have a very beautiful or good-looking face compared to someone who is hideous. You only notice it if you're ugly. While he is happy that his new face has given him a superpower, at some point he begins to doubt if he owns the new face or the new face owns him. It's an old story of who we really are. For Buddhists, the thing we call the self or ego is nothing but an illusion, a mask we put on, or a fake persona we adopt. In The Woman in the Dunes, it's the outside world that traps and alienates us. But in the face of other, Abe takes it even further, showing us that we are also trapped inside ourselves. We also alienate or deceive ourselves in order to achieve our goals. Okuyama's goal was to have sex with his wife, and to do that he creates a whole new face, a whole new self, which results in his old self to be destroyed. As animals, we peacock all the time. Makeup, plastic surgery, nice clothes, fast cars are just a few examples of how we camouflage our weaknesses. But at some point, we lose who we are. The more you change, the more difficult it becomes as who we really are. Kobo Abe is often compared to Franz Kafka because both wrote about the nightmares of existence where individuals are paralyzed under their existential duties. As children, we are led to believe that there is freedom to be enjoyed, but as we grow up, we are shackled by duties, responsibilities, and things to do. It's not society's fault or anyone's fault. It is simply the fault of idealism bestowed upon young people that each one of us is capable of changing the world. Dostoevsky showed us this idea in Crime and Punishment, which led Raskolnikov to spend years in a Siberian jail to sober up from the intoxication of his idealism. As we grow, reality slowly beats us down, so we accept whatever life throws at us. We become like Junpei Nikki, clearing sand every morning and sleep at night while more sand is blown onto our desks the next day. Instead of sand, we clear paper on our desks or move files on our computer hard drive. Work never ends, but our lives do end. Work is infinite, but life is finite. Abe's writing is not as dark as it sounds. While he's compared to Kafka, he also has a lot in common with Albert Camus, which makes his fiction a little bit more hopeful, or his characters ultimately accept their fate and carry on with life. Both Camus and Abe grew up in a different culture, Camus in Algeria and Abe in Manchuria. Both became members of the Communist Party, and both quit party politics to focus on theater production. Unfortunately, Camus died prematurely in a car accident while Abe lived to be 68. I think their Marxism made their fiction a little hopeful. Not much, but a little. Marx believed in a future society where everyone is happy, but in Abe's work, it's more like contentment, accepting one's fate. In other words, Sisyphus gets on with his job. He doesn't complain and life goes on. Reading Abe is actually palatable and at times enjoyable because his characters, settings, and stories are so far-fetched that we don't consider them to be about us, but they are perfect mirrors to see our own lives. But such is human nature that we never stop searching for the truer self, truer purpose, and the missing identity or the missing anchor. I guess human beings are here to search. It was the medieval Persian poet Rumi who said that we search for things that cannot be found. In Abe's work, the search appears almost futile because nothing yields. You might as well accept your fate. In the next segment, I'll discuss another giant of Japanese literature who not only tried to conquer the mind but also conquered the body. I'll talk about the last true samurai Japan produced. Previously, I talked about Kobo Abe and his pessimistic yet very realistic take on the purpose of life as nothing but work and duty. In this segment, I'll discuss the author who took the duty of honing his craft so seriously that not only he perfected his mental strength, but also his physical strength. Not only did he become one of the greatest Japanese novelists, but he also became one of the last samurais to step foot on Japanese soil. Yukio Mishima rebelled against the nihilistic trend in Japan where material comfort and hedonism had replaced discipline, courage, and honor. Yukio Mishima was born in 1925 in Tokyo. At a very young age, he started writing stories. Age 16, he submitted a short story titled Forest in Full Bloom to his teacher, depicting the kind of spirit of his ancestors still being alive within him, which was published in 1941. At the time, Japanese nationalism was at its height due to World War II, and his story of old Japan still alive was a proud moment for those who read the story. In 1944, upon graduation from high school, he was drafted for the military, but during the medical checkup, he was disqualified due to his tuberculosis. He was disappointed. To add insult to injury, in 1945, Mishima's mood took even a darker turn when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender to the Allied forces. Even worse still, his 17-year-old sister died of typhoid that same year. Then, adding to his miseries, the girl he loved in high school and whom he was supposed to marry ended up marrying another man. So 1945 was not only a turning point for Japan, it was also a terrible year for Mishima personally. He took refuge in writing novels. In 1948, he published his first novel titled Thieves, about two men who are drawn to ending their lives. A year later, he published Confessions of a Mask about his teenage crush on another boy. In 1954, he published The Sound of the Waves, which made him really famous. People on the political right loved it for its beautiful depiction of love between a fisherman and a female pearl diver. The political left, however, called it fascistic for glorifying old traditions. By now, Mishima hated the leftists. In 1955, he shifted his attention to weightlifting. As a somewhat weak man, he suffered from an inferiority complex, so he trained almost every day to become one of the fittest writers in the 20th century. In 1956, he published one of his most famous novels, The Temple of Golden Pavilion. In 1964, he started publishing The Sea of Fertility, a series of 4 novels which he considered his favorite, which he finished the day before his death. Mishima despised how Japan was changing. Materialism and consumerism were the new ideologies taking over Japan. Quote, "I cannot have much hope for the future of Japan. As days pass, I feel more and more deeply that if things should proceed this way, Japan, quotation marks, might end up disappearing. Japan might disappear, and in its place, a large economic country which is inorganic, vacant, neutral, medium-colored, wealthy, and shrewd would remain at one corner of the Far East. I don't feel like conversing with those people who think that that's all right." In 1970, Mishima and 4 other men stormed the military headquarters in order to inspire a coup and failed. He ended his life right there. Published in 1963, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea is one of Mishima's most popular novels. It tells the story of a teenage boy, his mother, and her lover, a sailor. Noboru, a fatherless 13-year-old boy, spies on his mother, Fusako, having sex with a sailor named Ryuji. At this point, the boy, who is mesmerized by the allure of the sea, feels his connection with the sea is established through the sexual encounter between his mother and the sailor. Noboru considers the seas as the only true meaningful entity in this world. Therefore, he has immense respect for Ryuji, the sailor. He tells his friends about Ryuji, describing him almost like a mythical hero. But it's all about to change. One day, the teenager Noboru sees Ryuji drenched in fountain water inside a park. He feels his hero is nothing but an undignified loser. Later, when his mother announces that she is engaged to the sailor, Noboru loses all respect for the man. He was supposed to be a heroic sailor, taming the wild seas, but now he has become like a domestic animal, a husband to his mother. When Fusako discovers that Noboru spied on them having sex, she tells Ryuji to punish the boy, but the sailor tries to be kind father. This further damages his reputation as a hard, masculine man. Noboru is fed up with his soon-to-be stepfather and calls an emergency meeting with his gang of teenagers. They lure Ryuji, the sailor, to a dry dock in order to murder him so that at least he dies as a hero. The teenagers plan it meticulously with tea, pills, rope, blindfold, etc. Ryuji is so tame that he has absolutely no clue whatsoever. I don't want to spoil the ending. Some suggest the novel shows teenage psychopathy, similar to The Lord of the Flies by William Golding, published some 9 years before this. But Mishima wanted to depict a teenage boy's obsession with a man who had abandoned society for the sea. This allure of freedom is the theme of all pirate stories that have lived with humanity for millennia. But I think Mishima understood the role of a man in Japanese society was to be out there, not sit at home, be comfortable. Ryuji had to be at sea to keep his identity intact. For Noboru, Ryuji and the sea were one and the same thing. Once that mask fell off, the teenager felt betrayed. Today, Japanese people, especially men, have a deep sense of identity with their work. Without work, a lot of Japanese feel a bit lost. People continue on working after retirement age because work is deeply tied to the meaning of life, as is called ikigai, one's personal purpose in life. Noboru had no father figure, therefore he looked up to the sailor as a male role model and hero. But when the sailor gets tamed by the teenager's mother, he loses all respect for him. The novel has a few disturbing scenes of utter cruelty, leading people to conclude that it's fascistic in its approach. Mishima depicts the sea as a character in the novel, so while Ryuji is at sea, there's calm on land, and when he's on land, there's cruelty on land. The story here is a little like during the wars. Coward soldiers were shot dead by their own army for not fulfilling their roles. Despite its cruelty, the writing's beautiful. Here's a quote. Sometimes, as he listened to the song or hummed it, tears brimmed in his eyes, just as in the lyrics. Strange that a man with no ties should become sentimental about a harbor town. But the tears welled directly from a dark, distant, enervated part of himself he had neglected all his life and couldn't command. Published in 1949, Confessions of a Mask is a coming-of-age story about a teenage boy called Ko-chan, whose weak, fragile physique makes him stand out. Instead of growing resentment for the stronger boys, he falls in love with another boy called Omi, whose robust, masculine body he adores. He is so obsessed with the manly, masculine body that when he learns a picture of the knight he adores is not a man but of a woman, he's devastated and immediately starts to hate Joan of Arc for imitating a man. He despises her for putting on a man's clothes and pretending to be a man. People consider this novel to be a confession of Mishima's own homosexuality, but when you look at his own life, throughout his teenage years he suffered from an inferiority complex. He was kept inside a house for years and not allowed to play sports or hang out with other boys in case he gets injured. As a result, he grew up somewhat feminine and he hated himself for that. In this novel, this self-hatred manifests itself in a homosexual love for another man who symbolizes everything he lacks. Man. Ko-chan loves the other boy because he has a strong body, confident personality, courage, and the ability to beat other boys in sports, and most importantly, the ability to attract all the girls, all things he himself lacks. Confession of a Mask is an extremely honest novel. It might have damaged Mishima's own image among his conservative friends, but he didn't care because he wrote it despite others might have judged him. His honesty is clear in this novel. Published in 1956, The Temple of Golden Pavilion is a novel set in the old capital of Kyoto. It fictionalizes an actual event that took place in 1950 when a monk burned down one of the most iconic Buddhist temples in Kyoto. The novel is about a Buddhist priest named Mizoguchi who is obsessed with Golden Temple. Growing up, his father told him about the wonderful beauty of the temple and introduced him to the main priest at the temple. After his father's death, Mizoguchi becomes a disciple. Despite his deep infatuation with the temple, he also wants it destroyed because there is a discrepancy between what he imagined the temple to be and the actual temple. This is very Proustian in that we only imagine things that are not real. So Mizoguchi secretly hopes the Americans will bomb during the war. But Kyoto is spared, so he decides to take the matters into his own hands. The bulk of the novel is about Mizoguchi's friendship with two men, a few women, his studies, financial issues, his dealings with prostitutes, and most importantly, his mental deterioration. Once all his hopes of the temples being destroyed in the war is dashed, he decides to burn it down himself. Like a jealous partner, he doesn't want others to enjoy its beauty. Quote, "It's no exaggeration to say that the first real problem I faced in my life was that of beauty." Mishima in fact visited the actual arsonist monk before his death. He was released from prison due to his mental health, but unfortunately his mother jumped in front of a train. perhaps due to the shame the incident had caused her family. The Golden Temple is a paradox. Zen Buddhism promotes simplicity, austerity, and detachment from worldly possessions, while the temple is flashy, ostentatious, and gold. There is a simple explanation for that. It was originally built as a palace for a military leader in the 1390s, but later it was donated to a temple. But for Mizoguchi, the paradox of imagined beauty and the physical reality leads him to destroy the actual thing in order to preserve the beauty that existed in his imagination. As Bruce said, you cannot imagine something that is real. As soon as you see the actual thing, that image is destroyed in your head forever. This is why the monk wanted to destroy the actual thing. Yukio Mishima was a brilliant writer, but he was also a controversial figure due to his politics. The left labeled him as a fascist, but there was no doubt that he pushed himself to an extremes of mental capacity as a writer and to the extremes of physical capacity as a bodybuilder. While some might consider his ideas dangerous for the average man, he certainly showed that one can train both the mind and the body to the next level. As a young man, he was feeble, weak, and short. He was 163 centimeters tall. This physical weakness led him to prioritize his intellectual muscles. So he sat down and became a writer. But then he realized that one of his arms had grown 10 times larger than the other. So he started training his muscles to build himself like a tank. He achieved both intellectually and physically, but each of his journeys taught him different things. Through reading and writing, he connected with the community of writers from centuries ago. This intellectual bond made him understand the power of human imagination, something we all share. But through bodybuilding, he connected with millions of years of evolution. Muscle is a lot older than our intellectual capacity. Through physical muscle, he could connect with the warriors from thousands of years ago. He could understand heroes and villains to a deeper level, not just through written words, but through muscle fiber. He was an intellectual brother to many writers and artists, but he was also a muscle brother to all the human beings. He spent half of his life building his intellectual and mental capacity, which resulted in some amazing novels that are deep and profound. He then spent the other half of his life building his body so he could have a heroic death. A dead body is not pretty, so Mishima prepared himself for having a body that belonged to heroes, not to a sick old man. Mishima wanted to die like a true samurai while his body was still beautiful. His main message in life, as well as in public death, was that materialism and consumerism can fill your house, but it will leave you empty on the inside. The more you consume, the less you build your character. So Mishima wanted to show that life is not about comfort, but it's more about struggle to become great, like the Nietzschean Übermensch. In the next segment, I'll discuss a writer who's not only conquered the domestic audience, but also conquered a massive international audience to make him the most successful Japanese novelist of all time. Previously, I discussed Mishima, one of the most controversial Japanese writers who pushed his mind, his body, and his politics to an extreme. In this segment, I'll discuss perhaps one of the least controversial Japanese writer who is loved inside and outside Japan. Haruki Murakami was born in Kyoto in 1949. While World War II devastated Japan and other major cities, Kyoto remained relatively unscathed, partly due to its historic value and partly because it had no military significance. Both of his parents were literature teachers, so growing up he read a lot of Western novels, mainly American, Russian, and French. He studied drama at Waseda University in Tokyo. After graduation, he opened a jazz bar in Tokyo with his wife Yoko, and they decided not to have children. In 1979, he published his first novel, Hear the Wind Sing. It's about a memory of a wild summer in the 1970s with all the strange things like a girl without a little finger. In 1980, he published his second novel, Pinball 1973, about a man's obsession with, you guessed it, a pinball, a real boy and his toy. In 1982, he published a longer novel, A Wild Sheep Chase, which propelled him as a serious novelist. It's a kind of a detective story in the underground world to find a sheep with a birthmark. These first three novels are often referred to as a Rat trilogy due to the character Rat appearing in all. In 1985, he wrote Hard Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World, a parallel narrative that takes the bizarre and surreal to an extreme. Well, the end of the world kind of extreme. His fame was growing, so he felt uncomfortable with the attention he was receiving in Japan. So in 1986, he escaped for some peace and quiet in Europe and then America. In 1987, he published Norwegian Wood, about a boy nostalgically remembering his relationships with two different girls. This novel made him very famous and very rich. It's also one of his most famous novels. In 1988, he wrote Dance, 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 a sequel to Wild Sheep Chase. It's about a man who's trying to return to the past, but things have moved on, so he only encounters dreams and nothing else. In 1992, he wrote South of the Border, West of the Sun, about a boy and a girl who meet again after many years and they have to decide whether to rekindle the past or continue with their current lives. In 1995, he moved back to Japan following the Kobe earthquake and published Wind Up Bird Chronicles. This is a giant of a novel that tackles real social issues like war crimes committed by the Japanese in China, but it still has all the strange and bizarre things like a search for someone missing or sitting in a well or a body mark that has special power. Here, real is infused with surreal. In 1999, he wrote Sputnik Sweetheart, about a search for a missing person, unfulfilled love, and the struggle between individual freedom and social conformity. A lot of the novel takes place outside Japan, namely in Greece. In 2002, he wrote another big novel, Kafka on the Shore, perhaps his most famous novel, which is about a boy named Kafka escaping from his tyrannical father, just like the real Franz Kafka who disliked his father. Again, in this novel, we have a character who can talk to cats. In 2004, he wrote After Dark, about night work, prostitution, and dreams. In 2010, he wrote 1Q84. The title is taken from George Orwell's 1984. In Japanese, the letter Q and number 9 have the same pronunciation, so you can read it as 1984. In this novel, there are two parallel worlds, and a religious cult and the journey of characters to find what's real and what is not. In 2013, he wrote Carlist Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. It's about a man who was rejected by his friends and now he has to confront his past and old friends to understand why they rejected him. This novel became a bestseller around the world. In 2018, he wrote Killing Commendatore. It's about a painter who, after divorcing his wife, moves into another painter's house where he dives deeper into the history of Japanese invasion of China. In a sense, it's a bit similar to Wind Up Bird Chronicles that deals with real socio-political issues. But it also has all the surreal, bizarre phenomena like Hallmark of Murakami. He's also written 6 collections of short stories and 12 non-fiction books. What I talk about when I talk about running is about his running routine. He wakes up at 4 a.m. like the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and runs for hours before going for a run. Underground is another non-fiction book about the aftermath of the gas attack in Tokyo Underground in 1995. He interviewed the victims and witnesses to understand their experiences. He wanted to really know how it felt to be there and then. Murakami has been writing for 45 years non-stop. If writing is a battle, Murakami is a very disciplined, regimented, and successful soldier. His themes are wide-ranging from suicide, water well, death, consciousness, love, loss of mother, a lover, and life's choices. But there are a few common themes that appear in his writing. In Murakami's novels, there is always someone or something missing. This search is in fact a deeper search for meaning in life. Fundamentally, you could say Murakami's writing is an escape for himself from Japanese group culture for a more individualistic lifestyle, but also for his readers to escape in a bizarre, surreal world. In the early days in Japan, he was considered a black sheep or a punk in the literary scene. He didn't fit in very well. He fled Japan and went to Italy where he wrote Norwegian Wood. The setting of the novels tend to be isolated locations in the mountains and forests. So deep down, Murakami is trying to run away from the socio-cultural constraint of being Japanese in a highly group-oriented culture with a strong Confucian hierarchy. Confucius, the ancient Chinese philosopher who influenced Japan, promoted social harmony through hierarchical social institutions like family, state, and other group entities. This rigid structure can have a deep psychological impact in a globalized world that promises all kinds of individual freedom. Kafka on the Shore is a good example. He runs away from his tyrannical father. This escape also applies to his style. He combines different storytelling styles and even mixes high culture with low culture. Murakami often puts high culture of classical music, opera, classical literature in wacky, lowbrow environments. He says, quote, "I think if you are a fiction writer and you're too intelligent, you cannot write. But if you're stupid, you cannot write. You have to find a position in between. That's very difficult." He has found a balance between the high and the low, so his readership is wide-ranging. There's something for everyone in his novels. So his novels are a refuge for a lot of people. Aristotle came up with a formula for storytelling in Greek tragedies. Every tale has a beginning, middle, and end. Just like life itself, you're born, you live, and then you die. Murakami's storytelling follows this convention for the most part, but his genius is that he makes the journey or the process interesting. His endings are not very strong or memorable, but you always know his style. His novels are a kind of lived experience. In that sense, it's very Japanese. Japanese culture emphasizes on how more than why. Western culture is outcome driven, while Japanese culture focuses more on etiquette, rules, and processes. So how to do something is as important as the outcome. Murakami's storytelling is addictive because he grabs your attention in the details. If you skim through his novels, you realize they are quite cliched. Often boy meets girls or vice versa, or someone chases or is being chased. But through exquisite details in storytelling, he entertains us to read on to find out how things are done. Murakami says, quote, "I don't research when I write novels because imagination is my asset, my gift. I want to work on it fully." His writing, characters, and world he creates are all very fluid. Murakami's characters are very feline, free-flowing. Murakami has a cat as a pet, so perhaps he gets his inspiration from the pet. A cat is a free spirit. This process-driven writing is an artistic form where you are not concerned about what ought to be done, but what is done. Some writers have deeper political or even ideological convictions, like Dickens writing about the poor or their suffering. Murakami doesn't seem to care about any cause or even humans. In his novels, humans and animals are almost on equal footings. Perhaps his lack of a clear conviction prevented him from winning the Nobel Prize. He's not promoting some social causes like class or gender equality or any other issues such as the environment. He's simply trying to make sense of existence in a complex and confusing world of ours. In Western culture, the emphasis on knowing the reason behind every action that drives science and technology. But in life, and especially in the human psyche, things often don't make sense. You can't choose your family, country, language, even your job. You apply for 10 jobs, you get one. What if they chose the other job? You will meet different people. In Murakami's novels, a small incident, painting, or a person that you meet can change your life in a way that you have never imagined. This randomness is exciting. In Western crime fiction, you often hear detectives saying they hate coincidences. Everything has to make sense or has to happen for a reason. But Murakami's novels are full of magic, unexplained randomness that makes him very unique. Just as I discussed in my video on Dostoevsky, human behavior is for most part irrational and often doesn't make sense. And Murakami captures that. If you have read Murakami, you notice that as soon as you open a page, you will feel right in the scene. He has the ability to take you to that moment. This stems from the fact that he focuses on the small rather than the big picture. In 1995, after the gas attack in Tokyo, Murakami tried to find newspaper articles about how it felt to be in that moment inside the underground. to feel the smell, the noise, the chaos, but he couldn't find anything concrete. So he went and interviewed the people who were at the scene to write his book Underground, to capture the smaller details. In his novels, he grabs your attention by focusing on the small. It is often the case with Murakami's novels that you remember a particular scene like a fish raining from the sky or a man talking to a cat, but it's very difficult to remember an entire story. So his attention to details and focus on simple and small is very unique and fresh. If you summarize his novels, they sound very bizarre and somewhat dull, but it's the focus on the small things that make his novels so mesmerizing. You feel like in the moment, so the small is big for Murakami. His style and language are very simple too. He holds your hand all the way. If you ask a Japanese person for direction in Japan, they are most likely to walk with you to the place or draw a map for you. Murakami does that in his novels, so you don't have to go back and forth and if you miss something. His characters, scenes, and settings are very simple places. You can feel Murakami is enjoying the writing process itself, and this in turn is passed down to readers to enjoy reading them. He says, quote, "If you're a reader and I'm a writer, I don't know you, but in the underground world of fiction, there's a secret passageway between us. We can send messages to each other subconsciously." To conclude this long video, we saw how Lady Murasaki masterfully depicted male psychology almost 900 years before Sigmund Freud. Then we saw how haiku masters understood the human condition and tried to simplify life into 3 simple lines that we enjoy today. Natsume Soseki single-handedly introduced the modern novel to the Japanese and used humor to expose social changes that were taking place in Japan at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Ryunosuke Akutagawa used the short story as a medium to dissect deeper concepts and understand the nature of life in a rapidly changing Japan. Yasunari Kawabata looked to the past nostalgically and lamented the erosion of old Japanese traditions. Osamu Dazai captured the deep alienation and humiliation of people in a post-war Japan. Kobo Abe acknowledged this alienation but contended that there is no escape from this meaninglessness, so it might as well work day in and day out. Yukio Mishima too felt the alienation, but his writing showed the fragility of human mind and the human body, so he tried to conquer both. He lived up to his philosophy of life and death. And finally, Murakami continues his search for meaning through his fiction. He lacks the deeper conviction of those who came before and solely focus on telling entertaining stories. I should also add that there are a few other fantastic authors which I did not include in this video. For instance, the Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon rivals that of The Tale of Genji as it provides window into the Heian court. Unlike The Tale of Genji, the Pillow Book is more like a collection of thoughts, essays, anecdotes, poems, etc. Another great epic of Japanese literature is the Tale of Heike, written in the early 1300s. Another important piece of early Japanese literature is the Tale of Ise, written some 200 years prior to the Tale of Genji. It's a collection of poems. In the modern period too, there are a few great names whom I couldn't include here. The first and most important name is Junichiro Tanizaki, who was contemporary of Akutagawa, and they had a bit of feud on the nature of storytelling. Akutagawa favored less plot, while Tanizaki preferred a neat plot. Tanizaki wrote many great novels, and particularly his masterpiece, The Makyuka Sisters, is one of the greatest works of Japanese literature. In more recent years, writers such as Yoko Ogawa, Ryu Murakami, and Natsuno Kirino are great writers. Ogawa's novel The Housekeeper and the Professor is a beautiful novel. Another name I should mention is Sayaka Murata, who is very new to the scene with her popular novel The Convenience Store Woman. I should also mention Kazuo Ishiguro. While technically not Japanese, but his writing is so much closer to Japanese culture than the British, and especially the concept of duty. So Japanese literature is so much richer than I could ever manage to cram in this video. I hope this gives you motivation to explore it more. So what is the future of Japanese literature? Japan's geography created a social paradox. Due to its highly mountainous terrain, Japan developed dense cities, cramped neighborhoods, and crowded environments. Today, 90% of Japanese live in big cities, abandoning wide spaces in rural areas for cramped cities. While these tight spaces brought people physically close, psychologically people live a more isolated existence. Today, digital technology, especially social media, has created another social paradox around the world. While we are the most connected we have ever been in human existence, we also live perhaps the loneliest we have ever been. So the future of Japanese literature is bright because now everyone around the world understands the loneliness Japanese literature writes about. Not only allows us to understand our loneliness, but it also tells us to accept this as solitude. The difference between loneliness and solitude is your perception. Japan lived a solitary life for thousands of years before Buddhism arrived in the 4th century. Then, in the 16th century, when Christianity arrived, the Japanese said no to the outside world. We have accepted one religion from you, and that's enough. So in the 17th century, the country imposed an embargo on almost all foreigners visiting the country and remained isolated for 200 years. Today, while the country is open, the Japanese prefer to keep their distance. So it's not loneliness, but solitude that people crave here. And the Buddhist philosophy of non-attachment fits perfectly with living a solitary life. While Japanese manga is spreading like wildfire around the world, it's inevitable that Japanese literature will become more popular around the world. If you have made it this far, you're a true samurai. I salute you, or rather, I bow to you. Now my question to you, have you read any of these books? What do you think? Did I miss someone? Please leave a comment. ありがとうございます. Thank you very much.